Welcome to Fifth Dimensional Leadership. Today we have someone I consider to be a really fascinating guest. His name is Imran Qureshi, and he is the managing director and head of North America at WTW, Willis Towers Watson. That's a mouthful, right? He's responsible for their business in Canada and the US across all business segments, growing revenue, representing WTW in the business community, and ensuring the engagement of 17,000 colleagues. He previously chaired the WTW North American Inclusion and Diversity Council, where he collaborated with the council to define and execute priorities to drive a more inclusive and diverse workforce. And he previously sat on their growth board, which sought to increase the company's organic innovation efforts by supporting early stage ideas that can expand the innovation pipeline. He's held leadership positions in WTW's global services and solutions business. He's been there for over 24 years. I'm going to have him describe all of his trajectory for you. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in mathematics with honors from the University of Manchester in the UK. And he has an actuarial background, which I'm curious to hear about. So much more to hear about from you, Imran. Welcome to Fifth Dimensional
Thank
Leadership.
you, Ginny. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
So am I. You've got such a wealth of experience, and I'm always very intentional about wanting to help. Yes, this is about leadership, but I also want to help listeners understand certain paths into different worlds. You're in the professional services world. So, would you describe kind of how you found your way into this space and maybe a little bit more about the nature of the work that you and your organization
Sure.
do?
So, as you mentioned, my background is in pure mathematics and statistics. I have a minor in economics and politics, and I left college and embarked upon an actuarial career at a consulting firm. And what was interesting about that experience was that it married my love of math and the technical aspects, but also consulting. And the firm that I joined way back in 1993, which is actually 1996 was when I moved across. But when I joined back then, the company I joined was really focused on training you to be a consultant as well as an actuary. So there
Mhm.
was a
Mm.
level of development that I was getting around how to interact with clients and how to position complex ideas in ways that the client can understand and take action. And so that really appealed to me, and I embarked upon a career in the UK pensions environment. So this was a
Mm.
professional services company providing actuarial advice to other companies that had pension plans in the UK. Um, and yeah, I was there. I then got recruited to join another company, actually, an interesting opportunity to work in the global space. And I ended up joining a company that consulted to the headquarters of UK multinationals at that time on predominantly non UK benefit issues, pension issues, mergers and acquisitions, HR, human resources. And that opened my eyes to just the world, literally, because we were doing work
Yeah.
on a global basis. And that really appealed to me because my background is sort of made up of multiple dimensions. So my father was born in India, migrated to Pakistan when the country split in 1947. He made his way to the UK in the 60s. My mother's from Trinidad in the West Indies. She made her way to Britain in the 60s. So they met there, and that's why I was born there. And so I'd always had this inclination, this fascination with global issues. And I think that really
Hmm.
ultimately fueled my interest to come to the United States, which we can get into.
Yeah, that's a great quick summary. There's so much there to unpack, but you mentioned actuarial science. I've always found I worked for Prudential
Mm.
for about 5 years back in the day, and obviously I was not on the insurance side. I was on the commercial real estate side, but I did have to get my insurance license, and I've always found it that actuarial science interesting. I don't know that people understand it. Will you
Sure.
explain briefly what
Yeah.
it
So
is?
so actuaries essentially use mathematical models to predict the future under various scenarios. So what they're seeking to do is um, predict certain events based on data and models, and then take action today to either address that issue in the future or mitigate some sort of risk in the future. So let me give you an example. When individuals are part of what are known as final salary pension plans. So when they get a pension, which is
Mm-hmm.
based on their years of service and their salary at the point of retirement, a company has to set aside money to be able to fund that obligation, meet that obligation in the future.
Yeah.
And actuaries determine what the total liability is, so what the obligation is that they have to meet, and then they also determine how much money to set aside to meet that obligation every year. So that's
Mm-hmm.
an example of an actuary using mathematical modeling and actuarial science to be able to essentially try to predict the future. It's the same in insurance as well. I mean, take any kind of event, right? If there's a flood, for example, that impacts a
Mm-hmm.
building, um, the protection that either individuals have or companies have is to purchase insurance to cover themselves in that eventuality. Well, the
Right.
actuaries are responsible for helping the insurance company determine the premium to charge the customer or charge the client to ensure that they're competitive, but also to ensure that they have enough in reserves to be able to meet those obligations when those events happen. So actuaries are using
Based on these
correct. Yeah,
assumptions,
yeah,
these
yeah,
data points.
yeah. So
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
there's um,
Okay.
there's science to it, and there's a little bit of art to it.
Mm-hmm. I love it. Thank you for
Yeah.
that little lesson. Thank you. You're a consultant. You've been one for over 30 years. Consulting isn't the same as leading, right? I mean, but you have managed teams and are considered a leader now inside of this consulting organization. When did you consider yourself a leader?
That's a really good question. I think there's sort of a formal answer to it,
Yeah.
which is almost a validation of perhaps what you were doing already but didn't realize it. So in
Mm,
2003, in July 2003, I was asked to lead a small team. And prior to that, I was really an individual contributor. I was out in the
mhm,
market, consulting to clients, bringing in business, so selling. And when we won a project, I was responsible for marshaling the team underneath me to be able to deliver that project. When I was involved in a sale, I was the individual leading the team to be able to pitch to the client. And I didn't realize that those skills actually essentially represented leadership skills. And that's when I was asked to lead this small team in July 2003. So it was a bit of a surprise because somebody saw something in me that I didn't realize I saw in myself. And that
yeah.
probably was the first foray into leadership. And yeah, as I sort of navigated my way through that because no one gives you a playbook to say this is how you lead, right? And oftentimes, certainly in
No.
professional services companies, you get to leadership roles on the back of individual contributions, much like how I just described. And
Right.
the challenge is when no one gives you a playbook, is you have to stumble around figuring out how to do it. So you have to look to mentors. And I remember a conversation with a mentor, and he said something to me at the time, early in my leadership sort of career, as it were, saying we have to move away from a culture of heroes. And what he meant by that
Mm,
was we're made up of sort of individuals. And as an individual leader, I thought my value was by going out there on my own, continuing to sell and deliver work as an individual. But But actually, the value that he was suggesting I needed to transition to was to build capability in the organization, to replicate some of the things that I was able
That's
to do, marshal teams, empower them, engage them, and unlock their value. And that was the value I was able to provide as a leader. And that was a pivotal moment in defining my own leadership journey.
That's huge because I think people confuse managing and leading. They think they're the same and they're quite different. And you just articulated what true leadership is in terms of inspiring people, motivating them, harnessing and seeing the potential as people saw it in
Right,
you,
right.
right? So, wow, you picked the right mentor to help you understand that
Well,
early
it's
on.
interesting what you said because I was talking to a group of interns yesterday, and when you said you picked the right mentor, I think my mentors, and I can see them in my mind as I look back at my career, weren't necessarily picked by me. They happened to be individuals that leaned in and provided coaching and counseling and said the right things
Yeah.
at the right points in my career. And my goal, and
When you could hear
exactly
it.
that was it, right? And my goal,
Yeah.
my obligation was to listen and then to put that into practice. And
Hmm.
oftentimes you don't really realize the advice you're getting and the pivotal impact of that
Yeah.
advice until much later. And so it's really important to be
Hmm.
reflective, self-reflective around how one can improve. And that's really been the role of mentors for me.
Well, but I'm glad you kind of called me out on that because I think that people have a bit of a misconception about selecting their mentors. I'm sure you've had people come up to you and say, "Will you be my mentor?" After giving a speech, and it's like, "I
Yeah,
don't know you. I
right,
don't, I don't work with you. I don't know you. I'm not sure that's really how this should work." Um, but it is, I think, organic mentorship is
yeah,
ideal if you can get it, but it means in part that one, you're open
yes,
to it when someone leans in, as you said. Two, that there's a culture because I think there's value in having people from inside of your organization, right? To mentor you to the extent that you can get that. And ideally there's a culture in that organization that supports and even incentivizes people to
yeah,
lean in, whether or not you want to call it mentorship,
mhm,
apprenticeship, but you need people who it's not about getting credit, but they
right.
care. They care enough about the development of the people coming, working side by side and working, alongside and beneath them, bringing them up. And I'm not sure that organizations are actively cultivating that
Yes.
culture and incentivizing people in the right way to be
Yeah,
mentors.
it's a really interesting point, and there's a couple of reflections I had on based on what you were saying. One is, I think at WTW, it is a cultural attribute because you use the word culture, and I think it is
Good.
that's
Yeah.
critical. It's a cultural attribute where we are we do seek to develop others, collaborate with others,
Mhm.
mentor others, and I think that that's really critical. But I almost see that as sort of the first plane. I think the second plane is this idea of sponsorship. So, what are you saying
Mhm.
about the individual when they're not in the room? What are you saying
That's right.
to advocate on their behalf when you're in a closed behind closed doors, talking to others about somebody's
Hmm.
career, about their potential, about a project that should be assigned to them, about a leadership responsibility, about a promotion opportunity? That to me, that ability to advocate on behalf of the other is the next
Hmm.
higher level.
Yeah,
It's a separation from
that's
mentorship
right.
to sponsorship.
Yeah. Great distinction and a really important one. You can't always ask for sponsorship.
Right.
That usually is
Right.
organic because you might not know that you're getting this
Right. No,
advocacy.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I did have a conversation with somebody that did ask for it, and
Hmm.
it did cause me to think. Right. Think, is that somebody I feel that I can do that in an authentic way, right? That I can
Right.
advocate on their behalf.
And stake your
Exactly.
reputation on,
Exactly.
right?
Like your reputation,
Yeah.
because you're absolutely right. Your reputation is a function of who you believe is ready to be developed and promoted and moved along. So you're spot on.
Yeah. It's funny, as a recruiter, I would always make a distinction between referring someone and recommending
Mm,
someone,
mm,
right? Referring is, I know this person, I'm introducing you to them so that you can make your own
mm.
assessment. And the recommendation is, I know them, I can vouch for them, I'm staking my reputation on them.
I,
And there's some people for whom, it's a
right.
referral and that's it, just to
Right,
be clear.
right. No, I think
Yeah.
I think that's a great distinction. I think when you
Mhm.
recommend somebody, you've got firsthand experience of working with
That's
them,
right.
and
Yeah.
I think, like you said, we don't take that for granted, and your reputation is attached to that.
Well, and I'll tell the person too. It's like, I can't
Right.
recommend you. If you asking for a letter of recommendation, I can't because I don't know you that well. But here's what
Yeah.
I will do.
Yeah.
Um, so anyway, just these
Yeah.
little nuances, I think, especially for the young folks coming up, it's important that they understand what to
Yes.
expect. Um, Couple things that you consider yourself a person of color, and I would love to hear. You were raised in the UK. I'd love to hear what experiences you've had that have informed your thinking about where we are with regard to DEI, because you've operated in the DEI space in your work environment. So can you talk about that a little
Yeah.
bit?
There's a lot there. I
I bet.
I would say that, growing up in England at the time of the 70s and 80s, um, there was it was a challenging time, as you had folks like me who were children of immigrants
Mhm,
in the United Kingdom, and this tension between those essentially white people and non-white people in that country. And there's actually a really interesting movie. The premise is of an individual who gets obsessed with Bruce Springsteen. It's based on a true story, but it's called Blinded by the Light, and it shows Britain at that time, um, of the time that I grew up in, and you could see that tension. And I remember
mhm.
seeing it and think, just all the memories coming back. But you don't realize that sort of tension that existed until you have distance and perspective, right? So I would say that's probably
Mm,
my first experience of, I get the fact that I was different and a person of color, and
yeah.
and so when I came to the United States, um, 1997, I experienced what I believed at the time I thought was a meritocracy,
Mhm,
and the context was really a comparison point with the United Kingdom at the time, which I saw as having barriers to progression, whether they be around color, class, gender, age, and that in the US, I saw as a contrast where if you worked hard, achieved results, you would progress. Now, I think Britain has moved on since 1997, and at the same time, my eyes have become more open to the inherent barriers that exist in the United States. So that Pollyannish view that I
yeah.
had back then, I think I've seen the
Mhm,
barriers here, particularly of people, African American, Black people,
mhm.
Latinx people, other people from marginalized groups. I've seen those barriers, unconscious and conscious. My first experience of really, I guess, understanding just the role of DEI in the United States in a corporate environment was when we started talking about it more at work. And you know what I did?
Mhm.
I leaned out. I said I didn't want to be part of that. And I'm sure you're familiar with the term covering, right? This idea
Oh,
of
yeah.
you don't want to accentuate your difference in the fear or belief that you won't be able to progress if you did. And so
Mhm,
you cover that, right? You take a step back. In 2013,
mhm.
um, I had the opportunity to move into a new role to lead our Chicago office, and I realized that was a pivotal point for me. I realized that I not only had the opportunity to make an impact from a DEI perspective, I had the responsibility to do that. and
Mm.
that to me took
Mhm.
me away from this idea of covering, and essentially moved me out of the shadows to be a more prominent voice. And it's something that has been tested over the years, because in 2017 um, I was asked to lead our North American Inclusion and Diversity Council, which you mentioned at the outset. But again, it was like this tether that said, "Do you want to do that? Do you want to be the brown guy at the front of the room talking about DEI issues, right?"
Right.
Uh,
That's right.
but again, I said, not only do I have an opportunity, I have a responsibility. So that's
Yeah.
been, I guess, my journey, and I can tell you I've learned more as a result of my role on the Inclusion and Diversity Council about these issues than I've ever done
Mhm.
prior to that. And it has been
Mhm.
fulfilling, it has been enlightening, it has educated me in ways that I wouldn't have been able to be educated before.
This is a big question, but I'm feel compelled to pose it. Where are we, in your opinion, with regard to diversity? Let's start with the United States because I think we talk about it more given the diversity of our
Right.
demographics.
Look, there's a reality. Our country is changing, and you'll know
Hmm.
the data, right? A majority minority um, country by the year 2050, and that change is already starting to happen at lower ages, right? My children's ages,
Yeah.
that shift has already happened. So there's an inevitability, and I think that inevitability is causing a tension, right? I talked about tension in the context of when I grew up in Britain, when you had these wave of
Hmm.
immigrants in the 60s, 70s. Um, and I think I'm seeing a tension here. Different, but there is a tension, just societally. Um,
Yeah.
and and I think corporate America is grappling with that, and we're
Yeah.
seeking to drive a more inclusive environment. And at WTW, we deliberately switched the order where we had inclusion first, then diversity, because we believe that
Yeah.
if there's no point bringing in diverse colleagues into an organization and then it's a revolving door where they leave the organization because the culture isn't inclusive. So inclusivity is something I think many organizations are grappling with, and there are programs and their cultural imperatives that are seeking to try and address that. But when you look at the
Hmm.
outcomes, when you look at leadership ranks, for example, across many organizations, we're not moving to the degree that I think all of the
Yeah.
effort that is taking place would suggest we should be. Now, some of that there's a pace issue, right? I think that corrects itself over time, but I still think there are inherent challenges, barriers, unconscious and conscious, that do represent real impediments to progress. And I think we need to
Yeah.
continue to look to break those.
I I think I expressed to you, and I often do. I try not to stand on my soapbox when I'm trying to highlight bright minds like yours, but so much of the DEI issue, and I'm going to use the old term, not the one that you all use, just because it's a habit, it is to me about leadership, right? Who's making the decisions to hire, to promote? That those are people making conscious, deliberate decisions. They might have unconscious biases, they might have fears, they might have untrue beliefs, but nevertheless. And I just wonder the extent to which we are holding leaders accountable enough for some of these changes. And I don't want to necessarily be prescriptive about what they should be. This isn't affirmative action anymore. But at the same time, is there this meritocracy that you mentioned? Is it really there? And if it is, what is the standard, right? This norm? And is it really adapting to this changing demographic that we have, not just in the United States, but in the world? Big question. I
It
know that
is a
was a
big
lot.
question. Um, I think there are some positive forces at work here. Um, you have, if you look at ESG, and I know it's a label, and I know it has connotations attached to it, but there is a focus from investors and boards increasingly on the need to do this. And in part, it's a business imperative. So if you look
Yes.
at the talent challenges we're facing, I mean, to the last couple of years, great example, right? The Great Resignation, or you could call it, a number of other things. That has
Yeah.
put a spotlight on the challenge around attracting talent. So when there's a
Hmm.
scarcity of talent, you have to look at non-traditional sources of talent to be able to
That's right.
meet business needs. So that's one issue. The other issue is if you look at clients or companies, particularly with brand-facing consumer direct-to-consumer products,
Hmm.
if your consumers are changing, if your buyers are changing, you sure as you sure as hell better get it right if you're able
That's
to
right.
to be able
That's
to
right.
sell a product. So that pressure from boards and investors to drive change is one positive lever. I think the other
Hmm.
is the idea of sunlight. When you shine a
Mm.
light on what your practices are, what your demographics are, and you publish and disclose that data, and we've just done that at WTW, we're announcing that we're holding ourselves accountable because now
Hmm.
you can see what our demographics are. You can see our commitments to improve those demographics. So that accountability comes now internally and it comes externally through boards and investors. And I think that's a way in which, back to the point you raised, leaders are going to have to act in different ways given those
Yeah.
pressures. I don't know what you think about
Yeah.
that.
I would agree. I think that's right. I think I worry that some of the HR systems, and I'm not an HR person per se, even though I've worked in the talent space for all these years, that this we're not that the leaders and managers aren't necessarily using these systems. I'm talking about performance evaluations. I'm talking about, things like competency based assessment, so that what what is the selection criteria? What is the criteria against someone is getting promoted, right? Because it's one thing to share the numbers and to have this sunlight and this
Right.
visibility. It's another thing day to day to be treating each individual with
Mm,
fairness, right?
mm,
Equity, that's the
mm,
equity piece, respect,
mm,
empathy,
mm.
trust. And these are some of the things that I think these I go back to these HR systems, I think they were put in place.
Right.
Feedback, right? You and I know, I don't know about you, in your early career as a person of color, I didn't always get it. Because and I've had managers say to me, Jenny, in all honesty, I'm not comfortable giving it to women and people of color because I'm fearful that they're going to think I'm
Mm,
discriminating. If it's more
mm.
critical feedback. And I'm like, but you realize that you're putting them at a
Yeah.
disadvantage. And yes, but I still can't really do it. So I'm just concerned that some of these they're considered sometimes annoying things that a manager or leader has to do, right? When you do your performance evaluations, you're doing your succession planning, your talent planning. But I also think this is where a lot of that stuff really matters in how people
Mm.
feel valued and seen, and hence the degree to which they're going to
Right.
stay.
I think you're spot on, right? The systems, the processes, and if you look at every step of the talent life cycle from
Yeah.
recruiting, hiring, onboarding, rewarding, developing, promoting, um, every step is fraught with potential unconscious or conscious bias, right? So your point
Yeah.
around being intentional about the processes and systems to be able to mitigate
Mhm.
those biases is critical at
Mhm.
every single step.
Yeah.
And I think we are
Yeah.
making progress, but I think there's another piece to
Mhm.
that as well, and it gets back to a word you used. When you are intentional about restructuring these processes and when you communicate that you're doing things differently, you start to build trust.
Mhm.
So then there's a view from
Yes.
an employee that there is integrity in the process. There is integrity in the way in
Yes.
which we're thinking about rewards and recognition and promotion and development, that there is fairness, to
Mhm.
use your words, there is equity. And when you do that, when you can build that culture of trust, when you can build that culture of psychological safety, then I think you start to move the dial. I mean, we over the years we've done all kinds of things to be able to mitigate some of those biases, right? Ensuring that we have diverse
Mhm.
slates of candidates, that we have interview
Right.
panels that are diverse,
Mhm.
that when we look at rewards, that we're looking at calibration. So you have multiple
Mhm.
teams looking at what we're paying people and what we're providing in terms of bonuses. And that once we've done
Yeah.
that, when we've calibrated, somebody independently in HR is looking at the data to say these are our demographics. Now, does that
Mhm.
do the outcomes that we've just gone through match our demographics? So there are checks and
That's right.
balances all along the way, and we continue to try to do more. I was on this when I was talking to the interns yesterday, and I got a question around inclusion and diversity, because increasingly we are getting. I mean, this is the next generation, right, coming into the workforce, and
That's
this
right.
issue is top of mind. And they asked me, what am I doing personally? And I gave some of the responses I just gave you. But I also said that when we look at um, panels, whether those be leadership panels
Mhm.
or panels of our clients, of speakers at different events, we have to be very intentional about the makeup of those panels to ensure that
Mhm.
people in the audience, whether they be colleagues or others, can see themselves, that they can see a role model, that they can see somebody that
That's
looks
right.
like them. And that to me, I mean, those are, they may be small, but when you aggregate all of the things that we've just talked about, they become meaningful.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so true. And you're so right that there's an expectation among our young folks, Gen Z, millennials. It goes. It's not
Right,
new, but I think it's they're becoming more discerning
right.
even, and saying I'm not going to go where I don't feel included, where I don't feel like my company stands for something, which is a
Yeah.
perfect segue to something that you talk about, which is purpose driven work. And it's meaningful to you personally, but also more broadly. Would you talk about that a little
Yeah,
bit?
and maybe I'll share a story related to this. A number of years ago, I was having dinner with a friend, and he asked me. He said, "Why do you do what you do?" And
Mm.
I stumbled around an answer that really was somewhat incoherent, and this other individual gave a very succinct and powerful response to the question that he had asked me. And I felt actually pretty inadequate and a sort of sense of emptiness at that time. And I spent
Mm.
a year being very introspective around determining why is it that I do what I do. And where I crystallized my purpose was about the idea of unlocking and unleashing the power and potential in others so that they can realize their own purpose. And so that became to me, it wasn't about what I was doing, it was about how I was doing it. And that became a really important driver for me. And I started to realize when I'm not doing that, that's when there's a sort of sense of emptiness or a sense of unfulfillment is probably the best way of describing that. And then
Mhm.
shortly, a few years after that, after really crystallizing that, I remember listening to somebody on the radio talking about the idea of joy. And so I appended something to that statement, right? To unlock and unleash the power and potential in others, but while experiencing moments of joy along the way. And to me, that is
Mm.
about being cognizant of the moments that you're in and recognizing when you're experiencing that joy. Because when you're not cognizant of it, then you're not you just you're then oblivious to those moments. And I define joy as being really simple, right? It could be, looking back on my
Mhm.
back at my backyard with a cup of tea or coffee, or having a real substantive conversation like you and I have. Like this is a joyful moment because it's real and authentic,
Yeah.
right? And And to me, that crystallization of purpose is critical. But I also recognize that not that everyone's purpose is very different, right? An individual's
That's right.
purpose could be as succinct as I want to provide for my family, and that's a critical, important purpose. And then the question then is, what are we doing as a society to enable that? And I think you're seeing some of the
Yeah.
shift in balance that's going on right now, where the employee, given the talent shortages, has more
Mm-hmm.
of the perhaps holding more cards around that question.
Mm-hmm.
And as they seek to provide for their families, they're the ones that are exercising choice. So I think that's why you're seeing this focus from companies on the employee experience. So if
Yes.
companies can attract and retain and engage employees so that they could
Mm-hmm.
um, live their purpose by providing for their families, as an example, then that company is better and the employee is better. I think that's why seeing some of the unionization efforts as well. That balance is
Mm-hmm.
shifting.
Yeah.
So I think purpose
Yeah.
transcends like lofty perspectives or individual perspectives, but I think the key
Mm-hmm.
is asking that fundamental question: Why do you do what you do?
Yeah. It feels to me like so much of this has to do with an awareness of self, right? This goes back to something you said 20 minutes ago around you alluded to, I think I don't know if you said self awareness exactly, but that was the reference. And I'm just hopeful and concerned that some people, well, I'll also say, and well being, right? And especially coming out of COVID, my fear is that a lot of people lost their footing if they ever
Mm,
had it. And it feels like there's a bit of it, I don't, whether it's a continuum or just a pot of things that help with in support of one's purpose, because your purpose can
right.
change. I think a lot of young people get daunted. It's like, what is
Mm,
my purpose? I'm 25 and I don't know what it is. It's like, it's okay. Your purpose right now can be to
right.
learn,
Right.
and to get to this place where you can be more of a contributing factor in your organization. So here's the question for you, I guess, when I'm thinking about this whole idea of purpose. Do you have a particular faith or
Mm,
mindset that supports that? And because the piece about joy I love, and I think that triggered for me this notion of
mm,
mindfulness and being
mm,
present, so that you can in the moment
mm,
know we this is a joyful moment
right.
between you and me, because we are being authentic, because we're talking about things that hold meaning for
Right.
each of us, deep
Right.
meaning. So where is there faith, is there a grounding that you have that allows you to have clarity about this purpose and know this joy?
Um, I think there are a few ways in which I think about the idea of what grounds me and what are the necessary conditions that allow me to experience joy. But but I but if I go back 20 plus years, I remember doing this exercise, which was one of the most sobering, impactful exercises I've ever done. Um, and it came from Stephen Covey's Seven Habits of Highly Effective People. And there's a habit in there called
Mm,
begin with the end in mind. And he invites you to write your own eulogy. And when you write your own eulogy and you pick people from various aspects of your life, it could be a colleague, it could be a boss, a spouse, a child, somebody from your community, your a faith that you practice, and somebody from who represents a leader within that faith. Um, Whatever it may be, you then write a paragraph around what you would want each of them to say about you at your own funeral. And if nothing
mm.
crystallizes that ultimate end in mind, that is it, right? That is the crystallization. And so you then back into that, right? So you then back into how do you live your life? day to day in accordance with how you want those individuals at that ultimate end to think and talk about you. That's incredibly sobering. And
Mhm.
so you talk about self
Mhm.
reflection and the ability to be introspective. That's a way to do that. And but just be prepared for what that's not a small exercise. That's a major exercise. But I did
No.
that 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's not
I
10 minutes.
did that 20 years ago, and I there was some realizations I had. Right, I knew which things that had a visceral reaction that I abhorred. Right, so any in
Mm.
if there's a lack of integrity in a system or an issue, that's problematic for me. If there's a lack of justice, um, these are physical reactions I get to these ideas.
Mhm.
And then the
I'm with
third,
you.
which is something I've worked at because it is a problem, um, is lack of competence. But there's a whole reason why individuals may not be competent, right? There are lived experiences, there are
Yeah.
resources. So I've had to work at that piece.
Mhm.
But that's sort of
Mhm.
the if you like, the negative side. More on the positive side, back to the original question. The idea of growth is really important to me, right? And I think that's where
Mhm.
you see that around self-reflection. So I believe as soon as you become comfortable, you stop growing. And so I deliberately seek out discomfort as a means in which to grow. So that's one thing. Secondly, I have a insatiable curiosity. So I oftentimes ask why, and I'm really curious to just understand people. And that's my MO when I meet people is this level of curiosity. I think
Mhm.
the third is authenticity. I I don't think I can be anything but authentic, just the way I am. But I do try to represent that. And there's a vulnerability that's attached to that, right? Is they sort of go
Mhm.
hand in hand, authenticity and vulnerability. And I think the final point, which is something I've had to work at, is based on various experiences just growing up. I have a predisposition to being risk averse, and so
Mm.
I strive to try to fight against that, right? And that could be small risk aversion or big risk aversion, right? And that's another area that I've worked at. So I think those things, growth, curiosity, authenticity, and risk, underpins sort of that purpose, but that's linked back to that end
Mhm.
in mind and those core things that really matter to me.
That's beautiful. That's a great construct, and it's one that it's uniquely yours, right? You're not asking anybody else to have that set. It's sort of in that with that interrelatedness of those component parts. But I love the whole notion of writing that eulogy to get to that place. And I would love to see, for example, my son is 26. I'd love to see him do it
Mm,
now and 10
mhm.
years from now
Yeah,
again,
yeah,
because I think we
right,
grow and we
right,
shift and our values
right.
change.
Yeah, and I think we are a function of our experiences, and so
Yeah.
it's sort of I sort of equate it to when you experience art or music, right? You can relate to it in different ways. So one of my favorite albums of all time is Miles Davis' "Kind of Blue," and Miles Davis is "Kind
Kind
of
of
Blue." It
blue.
is just it is
Yeah.
a seminal album, pivotal at that time, and there's a track in there called "Blue and Green," which is my favorite track in my favorite album,
I've not
"Blue
heard
and
that.
Green."
Okay.
And it's there's the opening piece is Miles on the trumpet, but then but but the interaction I've had with that piece of work has changed over the years, right? I've listened to that ever
Mm.
since I was a teenager, and I can still listen to that track today, and I get something else out of it differently, and that's because my lived experiences uh, that's who we're a function of. So we relate to things differently based on those
Yeah.
experiences, and that piece of music is just it's timeless. Yeah, I recommend it. It's
I'm going to put that on as soon as we finish here. I love great music and because as you say, every it's going to affect
yeah,
each individual
yeah,
differently.
yeah. Yeah.
That's great. Art, music, all these things go with, I don't know if it's left brain, right brain, but I think it's important to have an appreciation for that aspect of our
Right.
existence to help us have some balance and to have a perspective that opens us
Yes.
up, right?
Yeah.
To more.
No, I mean, you've
Yeah.
said that so well. I couldn't have said that better. That's beautiful what you just said, because I think that is the function of art, right? Art allows us
Hmm. Hmm.
to experience and understand the world and ourselves in ways that we wouldn't ordinarily do if it were not for art.
Right.
And art takes the shape of all kinds of art, right? Visual, performing,
Hmm.
music, and that's how we make sense of the world.
Yeah. Yeah. I always want to be mindful of time. You're a very busy man with a huge remit, and it's a Friday afternoon. One parting question that I ask all of my guests, and that is if you have any words of wisdom, hope, healing for our audience, given everything that's going on in the world. You pick and take as long as you need.
Yeah, it's a I do, and I do so through the eyes of my children. Um,
Mm.
my son is a sophomore at college doing international relations and political science. My daughter's about to go to college to do mechanical engineering. And the way in which they not only see the world, but the way they understand their place in in the world and their ability to impact the outcomes in this world um, is is more significant than I've seen in prior generations. And it's not
Mhm.
just a desire; they're actually doing it. And so they are at the forefront of driving change in our society. And I can point to so many different aspects of society where I've seen that kind of cultural shift and not just optimism, but it's grounded on action. It's grounded on
Yeah.
in a fundamental belief that they have the ability to drive change. And that to me, that is cause for optimism. And
Yes.
if I had half of their, their abilities and their optimism and their belief when I was their age, and my entire generation, generation, if we all had that, the world would be a better place. So I am
Hmm.
hopeful for that reason, and
Yeah.
I that's the key to I think a lot of our future challenges.
I love that. I love that. That is so critically important to where we are now and shaping where we're going to go. And I think those of us of older generations, right, can learn a lot from that mindset that says, no, no, I'm not going to complain about what I'm seeing. I'm going to go
Right,
change it. I'm going to go do it. And not in a militant, angry way, in a very thoughtful, deliberate,
right,
purposeful
right.
way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think that gives should give us all cause for hope.
Yeah. Indeed. Imran Qureshi, thank you so very much for joining us on Fifth Dimensional Leadership. Your words are beautiful and inspiring, and I love seeing leaders like you out in the workplace, bringing up the next generation of leaders. And I wish you continued success and achieving that purpose. I think it would seem to me that you're living it. You're living your purpose, and I'm grateful.
Well, Jenny, I just thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. This was not just a moment of joy, but this will stay with me. This conversation, and I've just appreciated your insights, and I've learned from you through this conversation as well. So
Thank you.
I look forward to staying in touch and continuing these
Absolutely.
discussions.
Very important. You got it. Thank you. And that's our episode for today. See you next time.